If you guys have been paying attention to the news over the past couple of weeks, you might have heard something about President Trump's new steel and aluminum tariffs. You also might have heard some of the speculation surrounding the idea that this may initiate a trade war. And these fears may not be too terribly unfounded, considering that President Trump did tweet out that, quote, trade wars are good and easy to win. But I'm noticing that a lot of the media coverage surrounding the idea of a trade war doesn't actually provide a really good explanation as to what one actually is. It almost seems to be relying on the agreed upon notion that war is clearly a bad thing, like piggybacking off of its semantic weight. Which is really unfortunate because actually learning what a trade war is sufficient to be able to impress upon us that they are substantial events and that there are good reasons for why we've tended to try to avoid them in the past. So in this video, we're going to be talking about what a trade war actually is, who wins and who loses, and what it means to actually win and lose in the context of a trade war, and what it would mean for the United States if these tariffs were to trigger one. To do this, we're going to be using President Trump's tweet as a jumping off point, because economists on both the left and right saw this and started to feel a whole lot like Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi.
Impressive. Every word in that sentence was wrong.
But first, a bit of a backstory. So steel and iron production used to be a big-time industry in the United States. The American Iron and Steel Institute states that employment in the industry was at its peak in 1953 at about 650,000 employees. Looking at 2016, however, the Bureau of Labor Statistics pegged the total employment to be at about 83,000 employees, or just shy of 15% of that peak. Lion's share of that decline in employment comes from increased efficiency as a result of automation. It takes about 20% of the time to produce a ton of steel in the United States today than it did in the 1950s. But a significant proportion of that comes from the fact that we import more steel than we used to. This has served to drive down costs for consumers and for those who use steel to make other products, such as cars or appliances. However, increased domestic demand also means a decrease in domestic employment. A similar story can be told for aluminum, although its peak hit in the 1980s and its current employment is at about 58,000. It also doesn't really carry the same sort of nostalgic quality as steel does here in the US. Tariffs, like the ones that President Trump has employed, tend to be used to protect domestic industries. Basically, the idea is that you add an extra cost onto the goods that are coming in from other countries. By increasing their cost for the local consumers, you basically make it competitive with goods that are produced locally. Or you make it so that local goods are in point of fact cheaper, so that way there's more employment for the production of those goods. There's a lot more to it, but I'm just painting with like a broad brush here. The original tariffs that President Trump was considering were going to be globally applied, meaning that every importer of steel and aluminum products into the United States would be hit with this extra duty. For steel importers, it was going to be 25%, and for aluminum, it was going to be 10%, which is actually pretty big for a sudden increase. As soon as it was announced, a number of different countries threatened to impose their own tariffs on the goods that we export to them, thus sparking the threat of a trade war. So that's why we are where we are and why the term trade war started being bandied about. But what does it actually mean to be engaged in one? To get a solid definition of the term trade wars, we're going to be using Bear's definition of the term as illustrated in his aptly titled book, Trade Wars. As just a note, not everyone necessarily can dig Bear's definitions and interpretations, right? A lot of different scholars have tried to expand upon the idea or say that it's not necessarily specific enough, but in just about everything that I came across, his was the main thing that was referenced, so that's going to be where we start. According to Bear, trade wars are characterized by a prolonged period of economic disagreement where the parties utilize tariffs in order to manifest said disagreement, usually in a kind of escalating tit-for-tat fashion that we would see in battles and in traditional warfare. And he argues that there are three important theoretical facets surrounding when they're going to happen and between whom. First, you're not really going to see trade wars occur between two smaller states because they tend to lack the leverage and also really wouldn't gain that much out of it. Second, when you see a trade war occur between a larger and a smaller state, the smaller state is often going to be the instigator, but will ultimately capitulate to the will of the larger state because of how much power it has in that dynamic. Third, when you do have a trade war occurring between two large economies, what's going to happen is that they're going to have to go back at each other in a sort of iterated tit-for-tat fashion until they eventually cooperate. So, France and Germany may apply a tariff on US chicken. The United States would reply by applying a tariff on lightweight trucks, on brandy, and on potato starch. That's not a hypothetical, by the way. That actually happened post-World War II in an event that we now refer to as the Chicken Wars. It's a fascinating little bit of history that still plays a large role in the US automobile industry. There's a fantastic episode on Planet Money about this. I highly recommend checking it out. Link for it will be down in the doobly-doo. So that's what a trade war effectively is, when two quarreling countries start slapping tariffs at each other in order to try to extract some good that they desire. But the practice of slapping those tariffs is, very consequential. It can have very severe economic consequences. A famous trade war between Germany and Italy in the 1890s caused a lot of economic damage between the two, and some historians argue that it also caused Italy to get a little more cozy with the Austro-Hungarian Empire than it otherwise would have, on the eve of World War I. So are they, in President Trump's words, good? Hardly, and especially not so here. As explained in the book Trade Threats and Trade Wars, the United States has previously used the threat of a trade war in order to gain some sort of solid economic footing in a place that it wanted to be. For instance, the United States leveraged the threat of a trade war against Japan in the 1980s in order to make sure they had a better deal going forward when it came to microchips and satellites. We've also tried a similar tactic with another East Asian economic power, and it didn't exactly work out for us. We also tried similar tactics against Brazil, and they too kind of shrugged it off, meaning that this is not something that necessarily always goes in the US's favor. What makes it doubly bad here is that these instances were the credible threat of a trade war, or the credible threat of imposing tariffs that could lead to a trade war. But in this instance, President Trump has already leveraged the tariffs, right? He didn't go out and say, hey, you guys need to give us access to these markets or provide these sorts of things, or else we're going to slap you with a tariff. He's already slapped the tariffs. He's, nixed that negotiating position. He's already done it and set up a new status quo. He didn't make any statements, he didn't demand any concessions, he just did it. And although I tried my best, my Google foo is as good as the rest, and I still could not get to this, I could not find the works of a single economist that would back President Trump's claim that trade wars are good, largely because the consensus seems to be that they're not. This gets us into the question of whether or not they're easy to win. And the answer here again is no, for a few reasons. First, resolving a trade war requires a lot of time and bureaucratic effort. I couldn't find a single instance where a trade war had been initiated and then one party very quickly said, you know what, this is far too much for me, we're just going to capitulate to whatever demands you've made of us. It often takes months for a deal to be negotiated that is able to make both parties feel appeased, because they're not just dealing with negotiations between each other, this is what's called a two-level game. They're dealing with each other, but they're also dealing with the folks back home. And if they don't get certain concessions, or if things don't look their way, the folks back home aren't going to be too happy with them, and that could lead to problems come re-election. And during those months of debate and negotiations and posturing, you still have the detrimental economic effects of the tariffs in place. Second, it's difficult to think of what it means to win a trade war, because even if you managed to acquire the desired concessions, you still had to deal with the tariffs that they slapped on you, which had economic consequences. And historic analyses of trade wars show that they tend to be pretty bad. They have the potential to ripple throughout the economy, cause increases in inflation, decreases in actual wage growth, things that generally are things that this administration has stated that they're trying to avoid. And there's some recent history that we can draw from for this conclusion too. In 2002, President Bush implemented widespread steel tariffs on a number of different countries, although less widespread than those that President Trump is considering now. The EU responded by imposing tariffs on US goods, and when the dust had settled after President Bush had repealed them in 2003, economists showed that there was no real unemployment growth in the industry, in the steel industry itself, but there was increases in unemployment in the industries that were associated with the steel industry, such as, automakers and the like. As Coney Barrett recently said in a New York Times interview about the topic, the only people who seem to really win trade wars are the countries who weren't involved in them in the first place. The ones who get to stay on the sideline and watch other countries injure themselves and manage to get the spoils of whatever deals had gone sour in the first place. This leads us to the final question as to what would happen to the United States should a trade war erupt over President Trump's new tariffs. Right now, there are a number of countries claiming that they do not want to instigate a trade war, although currently they seem to be trying to pursue that route through trying to make sure that they are exempted from the tariffs, not necessarily because they're afraid to implement their own should they eventually be included in that list. Only time will tell who's going to be targeted by this at the end of the day. The way it currently stands is drastically different than the initial executive order that was proposed. Shoot, it very well may change by the time this video is uploaded. But contrary to President Trump's tweet, starting a trade war isn't like ditching on a restaurant bill. It's not like we get to go, suckers, we're now up on you by billions of dollars, good luck trying to get us to pay you what we owe, and then make a clean getaway, absconding with the metaphorical chow that we've put down. Economists on both the left and the right are going to tell you that the logic underlying that doesn't make a lick of sense. But if we were going to continue the analogy, and I emphasize that it is a strained one, it's actually more akin to them then saying that, you know what, we're not going to let you come back into the restaurant as often anymore. It's an over-exaggerated metaphor because as it stands now, there's no way that the United States would be excluded from the global marketplace and then the rest of the world would just continue on as normal. But there is the possibility that the new normal would be characterized by a diminished US presence in international markets. Using a new measure of international influence, political scientists Jonathan Moyer and David Bull create a simulation that looks at what these actions could potentially do to the balance of power on the global stage between the United States and China. As of now, the United States enjoys more influence than China does, and if just these tariffs were to be implemented, the balance of power doesn't necessarily change too much. If you were to start to see those sort of broader protectionist tendencies as one would expect to come about through an escalating trade war, then the balance starts to shift pretty dramatically. Indeed, 30 countries become more influenced by China than they do the United States, and this is problematic because a number of those countries are very strong US allies, are indeed very important for us strategically. By President Trump's tweet, it may be possible that he considers the United States economy as being just so large that it has just this massive amount of leverage over every other economy in the world. Unfortunately, however, this isn't the case. The United States economy is large, and per capita, it's one of the largest economies in the world, but there are other large economies. There's China, there's India, there's the EU, and a whole bunch of other ones. They're not necessarily going to be small. They aren't going to represent that dynamic that I mentioned earlier. It's going to be the battle between two or even several larger countries going at a tit-for-tat fashion with increasing tariffs. And in that sort of instance, just the plain fact is that nobody wins. That's not entirely correct. A more accurate way of saying it is that everybody loses, but we do so especially because we'd then be losing clout on the international stage. There are other options on the market now, and by taking a step back from it, by increasing these isolationist tendencies through the usage of what could be arguably described as an unnecessary tariff, we run the risk of having other countries develop stronger economic ties with our economic rivals. History shows that stronger economic ties tend to be strongly associated with stronger cultural and military ones too. These decisions are going to matter in a broad understanding of what power is on the international level. I'm curious to see what you guys think about Trump, steel, tariffs, trade wars, the whole kit and caboodle. Leave your thoughts for this or any other ideas that kind of cropped up in this video, or ideas for future videos. I'm always open to suggestions down in the comment section below. Look forward to reading all of them, answering a few of them in the next office hour. Sources for everything as always be down in the doobly-doo, as well as links to the Facebook, the Twitter, and the blog. Look forward to seeing you guys out there as well. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you consider giving it a thumbs up, and if you want to support the channel, you can do so by commenting down below, by sharing this video, or by subscribing to the channel to stay in the loop for more awesome social science content as uploaded. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.